Imagine you are standing in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula in 1930. There is nothing around you but sand, heat, and silence. No skyline, no highway, no airport. The nation you are standing in is so broke that its primary source of government revenue is a fee charged to religious pilgrims visiting Mecca. And thanks to the Great Depression collapsing economies across the world, even that trickle has slowed to almost nothing. The king cannot pay his bills, the treasury is empty, and the most powerful industrial civilization on earth looks at this land and sees nothing of value. Less than a century later, that same patch of desert controls the global energy market, owns stakes in some of the most powerful companies on the planet, and is constructing a mirror-plated city stretching 170 kilometers across open desert just to prove it can. This is not a story about luck. Plenty of countries found oil. Almost none of them did what Saudi Arabia did with it. To understand how the kingdom actually got rich, not just wealthy, but structurally, geopolitically, irreversibly powerful, you have to start with a moment of pure desperation. The year is 1933. King Abdulaziz is in a bind so severe that no modern government would recognize it as governance. The pilgrimage economy has collapsed. Foreign reserves are functionally non-existent. The kingdom cannot fund basic operations. Into this vacuum walked the Americans. Standard Oil of California, the company that would eventually become Chevron, arrived in Riyadh with a proposition. Give us the right to explore for oil across a vast stretch of your territory, and we will give you gold up front and a promise of more to come. The deal signed that year handed exploration rights to the Americans in exchange for roughly $35,000 in gold, a sum that sounds absurd now, but was, at the time, enough to temporarily save a monarchy from insolvency. The kingdom had essentially traded its geological future for the ability to make payroll in the present. What followed was 5 years of expensive failure. The American drillers sank 6 wells into the desert rock and found nothing. The executives funding the operation grew increasingly nervous. The money was bleeding into the ground with nothing to show for it, and there were serious discussions about abandoning the entire enterprise. Then the 7th well changed everything. In March of 1938, at a depth of nearly 1,500 meters, the drill broke through into something extraordinary. Not a trickle, not a modest discovery, a roar of pressurized crude so intense that the engineers struggled to control it. They had struck what would eventually be confirmed as the largest petroleum reservoir ever found on Earth. The lottery ticket had been scratched, the number matched. But here is the detail that most accounts skip over. When the oil began flowing, the Saudis did not get rich. The Americans did. The concession agreement was structured entirely in favor of the foreign operators. The kingdom received royalty payments, a percentage of production, while the real margins, the difference between the cost of extraction and the price on global markets, flowed straight into American bank accounts. The infrastructure was American. The engineers were American. The company that formed to manage the operation, California Arabian Standard Oil, later renamed the Arabian American Oil Company, or Aramco, was American in everything but geography. Saudi Arabia was not an oil power. It was a landlord collecting rent while the tenant built an empire in its backyard. That arrangement would hold for decades, and the patience with which Saudi Arabia dismantled it, piece by piece, over 40 years, is what separates this story from every other resource nation that tried and failed. In the early 1950s, a wave of nationalist sentiment was reshaping the developing world. Countries that had spent decades watching foreign corporations extract their resources were beginning to ask an obvious question. Why are we letting them do this? Iran asked that question loudly in 1951, when Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh moved rapidly to nationalize the British-controlled oil industry and expel the foreign operators. The British response was swift and brutal. They organized an international boycott of Iranian oil, starved the economy into crisis, and within 2 years had coordinated with American intelligence to remove Mossadegh from power in a coup. It was a lesson written in oil and blood, and Riyadh was watching every frame of it. The House of Saud drew a precise conclusion. Direct confrontation with Western power would be crushed. The only path was patience, legal pressure, and the slow accumulation of leverage over time. What historians now sometimes call the slow-motion heist began in 1950 with a threat and a tax loophole. King Abdulaziz signaled that nationalization was possible unless the profit split was renegotiated. Washington, terrified of losing Saudi Arabia to Soviet influence during the height of Cold War competition, quietly facilitated a new arrangement. A technical adjustment in the American tax code allowed Aramco to count payments to the Saudi government as foreign taxes rather than royalties, which meant the company's US tax bill dropped while the kingdom's share of profit rose. Overnight, what had been a deal heavily favoring the Americans became a 50-50 split. It was the first slice. The man who would take the knife and keep cutting was Ahmed Zaki Yamani. He became Saudi Arabia's oil minister in 1962, and he was unlike any negotiator the Western oil industry had encountered. Educated at Harvard and New York University, fluent in the language of international finance and corporate law, Yamani understood that the kingdom could not simply expel the Americans without the oil operations grinding to a halt. The technical expertise, the logistics, the refining knowledge, all of it resided with the foreign operators. So rather than seizing the company, he negotiated the kingdom into it. In 1973, Saudi Arabia purchased a 25% ownership stake in Aramco through a formal participation agreement. The following year, that stake rose to 60%, and in 1980, the kingdom completed what was, in effect, the most methodical corporate takeover in history, acquiring 100% of Aramco's shares. They paid market price for every one of them. No guns, no coup, no international crisis. Just 40 years of patient legal maneuvering that turned the Americans from owners into contractors. The company that is today Saudi Aramco, the single most profitable corporation in the history of human commerce, had been transferred from foreign hands to Saudi ownership without a single shot fired. But ownership of production capacity is not the same as control of price. And control of price is where the real power lives. That realization arrived with the force of a geopolitical earthquake in October 1973. The Yom Kippur War had broken out days earlier. Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack on Israel. The United States moved to resupply Israel with weapons and military equipment, and King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, a man of deep religious conviction and considerable strategic patience, decided the moment had arrived to demonstrate what the kingdom actually had in its hands. On October 17th, Saudi Arabia and the Arab members of OPEC announced a production cut and a complete embargo on oil exports to any nation supporting Israel. The United States was the primary target. The consequences arrived almost instantly. The price of crude oil quadrupled within weeks, moving from roughly $3 a barrel to nearly $12. Gas stations across America ran dry. Lines stretched for blocks. Fights broke out at the pump. The United States stock market shed close to $100 billion in value in 6 weeks. The industrial economies of the Western world, which had been built on the assumption that cheap energy was a permanent feature of the modern landscape, discovered in a matter of days that this assumption was not a law of physics. It was a courtesy that could be withdrawn. What made the embargo so effective was its financial logic. By restricting supply and letting the price rise, Saudi Arabia was actually selling less oil while earning far more money. In 1972, the kingdom's oil revenues were roughly $2.5 billion. By 1974, that figure had risen to more than $22 billion. The West had not just been embarrassed. It had been taught, in the most visceral possible way, that the balance of power between producer and consumer had permanently shifted. Washington's response to this lesson was not military. It was structural. In 1974, the United States Treasury Secretary flew to Riyadh with a mandate from President Nixon: negotiate an arrangement that would prevent this from ever happening again. What emerged from those conversations was an agreement so consequential and so quietly maintained that its effects ran the global financial system for the following half-century. The arrangement had two components. The United States would provide military protection and advanced weaponry to guarantee the survival of the Saudi government against any external threat. In return, Saudi Arabia would do two things: price all its oil sales exclusively in US dollars and recycle the surplus dollars it earned into US Treasury bonds. The mechanics of this deal were almost elegantly simple. By requiring that oil, the one commodity every industrial economy on Earth needed, be purchased in dollars, Saudi Arabia created a permanent structural demand for the American currency. Every country that wanted energy had to hold dollars first. This cemented the dollar's position as the global reserve currency with a force that no treaty or diplomatic agreement could have achieved. And by taking those accumulated dollars and lending them back to the American government through treasury purchases, Saudi Arabia effectively became one of Washington's most important creditors. The United States was borrowing money from the country whose military protection it was funding. Saudi Arabia was using American weapons to protect the oil fields whose revenues it was lending to America. It was a closed loop of such structural elegance that it became almost impossible to unwind. You do not bomb your banker. You do not sanction your arms dealer. The relationship was too deeply integrated to fail. For the next 2 decades, the kingdom spent lavishly on what that security purchased. No income taxes, free healthcare, free education, subsidized fuel so cheap it was effectively a national gift. Government employment for virtually anyone who wanted it. The social contract was explicit. The state provides prosperity, and in exchange, the population provides political compliance. For a generation, it worked. Then the oil market turned against them. In the 1980s, new production from the North Sea and Alaska flooded global markets. Demand growth slowed. The price of crude collapsed from over $35 a barrel to under $10. Saudi Arabia ran deficits for the first time in memory. The treasury that had been overflowing was suddenly being drawn down. A population that had been conditioned to expect permanent government largesse was now being handed budget cuts instead. The structural problem was not hard to identify. The kingdom had used a finite resource to build an infinite set of entitlements, and the math was not going to improve on its own. By the time oil prices crashed again in 2014, dropping from over $115 a barrel to under $50, the internal projections were alarming. At that rate of spending relative to revenue, certain analyses suggested the reserves could be depleted within a few years. The response was a man. Mohammed bin Salman became the dominant force in Saudi governance. After his father assumed the throne in 2015, he was young, aggressive, and possessed of a diagnosis that was simultaneously accurate and terrifying in its implications. The kingdom was addicted to a drug whose supply was limited and whose global demand was structurally threatened by the coming transition to renewable energy and electric vehicles. Vision 2030 was his prescription. Its ambition was not incremental reform. It was the wholesale reinvention of what Saudi Arabia actually was. The financial engineering behind the transformation began with what can only be described as a forced consolidation of wealth. In 2017, hundreds of the kingdom's most powerful princes, businessmen, and officials were summoned to the Ritz Carlton hotel in Riyadh. They did not leave until they had signed over an estimated $100 billion in settlements to the government in exchange for their freedom. It was brutal, legally ambiguous, and extraordinarily effective as a mechanism for centralizing capital. That capital, combined with the proceeds of a carefully executed initial public offering of a small slice of Saudi Aramco, just 1.5% of the company raised $25 billion, making it the largest IPO in history at the time, was channeled into the Public Investment Fund, the engine of Saudi Arabia's post-oil ambitions. The PIF's portfolio represents a theory about survival. Rather than parking surplus oil revenues in low-yield government bonds, as the old arrangement with Washington had prescribed, the fund began acquiring ownership stakes in industries that would define the global economy after fossil fuels became optional. Significant positions in electric vehicle companies, stakes in technology platforms used by hundreds of millions of people, ownership of sports franchises and entertainment properties on multiple continents, gaming companies, logistics infrastructure. The logic is not subtle. If oil revenues eventually decline, the kingdom wants to already own pieces of the industries that replace them. Every barrel of petroleum sold today is being partially converted into a claim on tomorrow's economy. Inside the kingdom itself, the transformation is visible in ways that would have been almost unimaginable a generation ago. The religious police who once enforced strict public codes have been largely dissolved. Cinemas operate, women drive, music festivals and sporting events fill venues. The social contract is being quietly renegotiated. The state is relaxing cultural controls while simultaneously tightening political ones. You can attend a concert. You cannot challenge the government on social media without consequences. The distinction is enforced with precision. The 2018 killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul produced a moment of genuine international revulsion. Western leaders issued statements. Corporate executives cancelled conference appearances. There were calls for accountability and isolation. Then oil prices rose, and within a few years, every major world leader who had condemned the kingdom was back in Riyadh for meetings and handshakes. The cynicism of that reversal is not lost on anyone watching. It is simply proof of a principle the kingdom has understood for decades. In a world that runs on energy, the holder of the switch has a particular kind of immunity. Saudi Arabia has also quietly begun repositioning itself within the geopolitical landscape in ways that would have been unthinkable during the height of the petrodollar arrangement. China has become the kingdom's largest trading partner, buying the energy that the United States no longer needs in the same quantities thanks to its domestic shale boom. In 2023, Saudi Arabia and Iran restored diplomatic relations after years of regional hostility, and the talks that produced that agreement were hosted not in Washington but in Beijing. The message was unmistakable. The kingdom is no longer exclusively aligned with any single power. It is playing multiple relationships simultaneously, extracting value from each without fully committing to any. The millions of migrant workers from South Asia and Africa who pour the concrete, lay the cable, and maintain the infrastructure of this transformation exist in a different Saudi Arabia than the one being marketed to global investors. Reform of the labour system has been announced and partially implemented. Reports of wage theft, dangerous conditions, and restricted movement persist in parallel. The line between what Saudi Arabia is becoming and what it has always been for those who build it is not always visible in the promotional materials. The story of how Saudi Arabia got rich is ultimately a story about leverage. Not just the leverage that comes from sitting on a vast reservoir of a substance the world cannot yet live without, but the leverage that comes from the patient, systematic, deliberate accumulation of control over every dimension of that resource. The right to pump it, the right to price it, the right to restrict it, the right to sell it to whoever offers the best terms, and now, the right to use the profits from it to buy ownership of the industries that will matter when it is gone. Venezuela has more proven oil reserves than Saudi Arabia. Nigeria has been producing petroleum for decades. Neither country did what the kingdom did, because finding the resource is only the beginning. What the House of Sword understood, perhaps earlier than any other petrostate, is that the resource is only as powerful as the institution controlling it. And they spent 40 years, one legal maneuver at a time, making absolutely certain that institution was theirs. The question that hangs over every gleaming tower and every futuristic mega-project in the desert today is whether the transformation they are betting everything on will actually work, whether a nation that built its entire identity around a single commodity can genuinely reinvent itself before that commodity loses its throne. Because if Vision 2030 succeeds, Saudi Arabia will have pulled off something that has no real precedent in modern economic history. And if it fails, the world will be left staring at the most expensive collection of unfinished monuments ever built. So, which is it going to be the greatest national reinvention in history? Or the world's most elaborate and costly gamble on sand?